moving on to the next question here, Adam, is I might move across from how organisations are using data and predictive analytics, because we've sort of covered that. And if it's okay, could we talk about what are some of the risks in this area? What about privacy? I'm sure some of these questions come up in your conversations all the time. Can you explain to us a little bit about risks and privacy?
Yeah, absolutely. So, data, many people will be very familiar with a lot of the risks that are involved in using data. It's obviously very topical right now. We've had recent headlines, and everybody will be aware of, the scandals in the US about hacking and personal information being used to, influence political outcomes, and a lot of different risks and outcomes like that. So it's a very important thing for our organization to be able to talk as well about risks and privacy. When we're talking with organizations about projects that we undertake with them, our first step, essentially, before we start working with their data, before we start suggesting that we start looking at their data, is to undertake a risk assessment. That risk assessment is really about trying to understand, we understand the data that you're holding. Perhaps we've had a conversation, and we know that there'll be personal details in that data set, and and it's really about us going, which elements do we really need, and which can we perhaps leave behind, when we take possession of the elements that we're going to use to create the outcomes and the insights that organization really needs. So that risk assessment is intended to document that process and really make sure that everybody who's involved is really confident that the right processes and barriers have been put in place to protect privacy and keep that data in a secure way. Other than saying it's really, really important to do, there are a variety of legislative frameworks that are in place that we're aware of and that we work to make sure that those organisations are protected and compliant. The Australian Privacy Act and the privacy principles that are in place are something that we help organisations to work through. We've done work with organisations around generating data governance frameworks, which essentially, take a snapshot of the regulatory environment and that organisation's operations, where the cross-pollination occurs, what are the key elements of those regulatory frameworks that they need to be aware of. There have been recent changes to that environment. So in 2017, we saw the introduction of the notifiable data breaches scheme in Australia. A lot of organisations have been doing a lot of work to understand what they really need to put in place to make sure they're ready to adapt to, the unfortunate circumstance in which perhaps their data has been hacked, from within their own organisation, or perhaps leaked by one of their employees. The General Data Privacy Regulation out of the European Union has also come into play as of May of this year, which again mirrors a lot of the elements that Australian organisations were already required to be compliant with, but with a little bit more focus on consent and a little bit more focus on the right of the individual, especially when it comes to things like being forgotten and having their data deleted. Privacy, risk, and security are core elements to our work in terms of how we help organisations to make sure that they are keeping on top of their obligations in that environment, and we help them work through a variety of different processes that we can put in place when we work with their data and when they work with their data to keep that secure. So as I said before, there's a risk assessment, and what falls out of that risk assessment might be a series of barriers that we can put in place, we can help them put in place, around keeping that data secure. So one might be governance, as we mentioned previously. So what are the permissioning rights and access protocols for getting at that data? A second barrier might be technology. So if we're taking possession of sensitive data, we can put in place technology barriers like encrypted devices, air gaps between storage devices and the internet, for example, and so lots of other esoteric types of technology.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, great.
And finally, modifications. So, what elements of the data can we obscure or leave behind, to minimize the risk or minimize the likelihood of that data ever getting into an environment we want it to be in.